Mental Maps is brought to you by Well. Well is a virtual holistic mental health service, providing psychiatric evaluations, holistic interventions, and when needed, medication management. For more information, check out Well at www.arukawell.co. That's www.arukawell.co. Welcome back to Mental Maps. As always, I hope this finds you well no matter what season of life you're in. Today, we are putting a wrap up on our discussion on minerals, right? So if you've been riding with us for the last few weeks, we've been working through some of the core minerals that are involved in brain health. We know there are many more that are out there, but we've really been focusing on the ones you can see in pop culture as well that find their way in many of the neurotropics and micronutrients that exist in our world. And so I definitely recommend if you're just jumping into this show, go back and check some of those out. I think they can be very helpful to you, not only personally, but if you're a healthcare provider, you may find it to be very helpful in helping other people, right? But today we're jumping into a mineral that was very similar to like what we talked about in iron, right? Where there's this homeostasis of the mineral. So if you go back to some of our earlier discussions, we talked about minerals where really a lot of the problems were driven on not having enough, right? Magnesium and zinc specifically. And then we got into this world like with iron where you can have too much and that can cause some problems. And today we're opening up our discussion on copper, which is another mineral that is all driven on maybe not enough or having too much. And issues occur in both those ways, which we'll talk about shortly, right? Copper is really interesting. So we're just kind of jump in and kind of talk about what copper is, how it found its way into our world, and then we'll go into what it's doing in the brain and then how to know if something's off, right? So copper is a fat and water soluble element or mineral. And I say fat and water soluble. What I mean by that is that copper in itself is stored in our tissues. And by being stored in our tissues, it's used for energy and other experiences in the body. However, it does dissolve in water. So even though it is a fat soluble mineral, right, where it means it's stored, it can be dissolved in water, which is kind of interesting. We see where copper in itself is present anywhere between 75 to 100 milligrams in our body, right? And it's kind of dispensed throughout the body, but it's really high in our brain, which we'll talk about shortly, but it's very present in our body, right? When you think of copper, you may think of the copper that we know of, right? In our world, the copper wire and pennies, if you're old enough to remember a penny, all these different copper things that are like around us. And to a point, those have been around for a long time. Like if you're a history buff, you remember the Bronze Age, which is like 3000, 2000 BC, where copper really found its way into our world externally in the goods and the objects that we're using. But copper has always been present within inside our body, right? Having a place and a purpose there. And so what we see is that most of the copper that we think of, we consume via our food, right? And we'll talk about foods that are high in copper shortly. However, some of the toxicities and the risks we see with copper is when it finds its way in our water, when it finds its way into other parts of our life, whether it finds its way into foods that may not need copper or it increases the copper. That's where we kind of get some issues there because copper is primarily absorbed in our GI tract. Right? So it's absorbed in our stomach and some of those other areas. It's stored in our liver. And then there's, like I said earlier, are very high levels in our brain, which are kind of interesting. With inside our brain, there's really three areas where you see copper to be the most prominent. The cerebellum, which is involved in balance and in other autonomics experiences. And the hippocampus, which is involved in memory and some thoughts. And then the basal ganglia, which is involved in like voluntary movements. So if you're not into this old sciencey world, in when you're thinking of it from this perspective, coordination, movement, thought, maybe respiration, other just numerous body parts, body experiences, as well as thoughts and memories are really related into the world of copper, right? Because those areas of the brain are really impacted. We also see there's really a couple of neurotransmitters that are important in the world of copper. We see where copper in itself will activate serotonin receptors. And we know that those serotonin receptors have numerous impacts across the brain and the body, right? Whether that be in the world of emotion or in cardiac functioning or in sexual function. We see it has to do with regulating other neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine. We also see where copper is important in the making of dopamine. As we talked about before, there are these kind of sequences that lead to the development of these neurotransmitters. They just don't pop out of the middle of nowhere. And copper is really important in taking a factor known as tyrosine and transitioning it into what's called L-DOPA, right? And that L-DOPA then becomes dopamine, which then, of course, leads to the making of norepinephrine. So you see where dopamine, that feel-good neurotransmitter that has all these functions in the body and the brain, is dependent on copper to be present to be made. And then norepinephrine, which you're thinking fight or flight, anxiety, depression, also important to be made from copper, right? We see copper modulates NMDA receptors. Remember, we've talked a lot about NMDA receptors in the world of minerals, right? And looking at like glutamate and excitability in the brain. And we also see where copper is important in creating BDNF, right? That's that miracle grow for your brain, that brain-derived neurotropic factor, right? And so you see where not only is copper important in certain brain areas, but it's also involved in the neurotransmitters working throughout the brain, right? Which is really interesting because you'd imagine if you don't have enough, you're going to have lower levels of those neurotransmitters. You're going to have poor modulation of them. Whereas if you have too much, maybe there's some problems in those brain areas, right? And so you see where there's really two distinct issues that occur in copper, either low copper or high copper, right? In low copper, you see what we would know as like hypoexcitability, like we've talked about before, fatigue, weakness, poor memory, slow thinking, tiredness, and then it moves into brittle bones and just this frailty that occurs throughout the body, right? So in the world of like mental health, low copper, you're really thinking of in a hypoexcitable way, right? However, in the world of high copper, we get a different world, right? Not only is high copper known to create toxicity symptoms, right? Which would be like oxidative stress, meaning that you're damaging the cells of the brain and the body, inflammation, which also causes damage, neuronal injury, right? Meaning that you're damaging the neural connections of the brain itself. You will have a low amount of serotonin because once again, this copper is activating those receptors. And so because of that, because the receptors are being activated, there will be a down regulation, right, of the amount of serotonin in the body. But there will also be too much dopamine and norepinephrine, which leads to what we know as that activation, right, that hyperexcitable experience. And so there are some case studies showing what we call in the world of mental maps and Aruka, hyperexcitable depression, right? Meaning that this person who's very hysterical, high crying spells, insomnia, overeating, there's that upness, right, occurs when you have too much copper. So low copper, fatigue, weakness, frailty, poor memory, poor cognition. High copper, turned up, activation, upness, right? So in this world, we know that both of these are really impacting some of this. At the same time, something that we've got to ensure we talk about in this world is hormones, right? We know that hormones, primarily estrogen and progesterone, are really driven in the world of copper. And we see where in the world of issues that are related to hormonal problems, such as premenstrual dysphoric disorder and certain menstrual issues and certain issues in the world of menopause and perimenopause, you see where these hormonal shifts are occurring because of copper retention, right? So if you have too much copper, you can also start having damaging in hormones. And so that's one of the reasons why you'll see some of these like copper driven rings and that kind of stuff used. I'm by far not a women's specialist, right? So it's outside of my world, but recognizing that not only is copper needed to make and modulate certain hormones, right? We see that a lot in like men's health and testosterone, but we also see it being really important because too much of that copper leads to a lot of these issues that we see coming out of estrogen and progesterone issues, right? So going back to what we talked about, you can have a low copper leading to the frailty and the lowness, the hypoexcitability. Too much copper leads to hyperexcitability. And then hormonal issues alone can lead to having too much of that copper, which is why many times that premenstrual dysphoric disorder looks very hyperexcitable, right? And so if you're looking at yourself and thinking, I think I may have low copper, right? How would this occur? Well, as we said before, we know that copper is primarily driven from food, right? It absorbs in our GI tract. And so we see where foods such as like beef, primarily like beef liver, shellfish, nuts, seeds, red meat, mushrooms, potatoes are all very high in copper. We know that beef liver in itself is the highest, which is one of the reasons you've seen, especially I would say in the past like 5 years, this movement for like people to consume beef liver tablets and those kind of things. What you're trying to do is get not only some of the other minerals there, but a good amount of copper in there, right? If you eat beef liver, it has kind of that like metally taste. And that's one of the reasons why, because it's so mineral rich. We know that you need around 900 micrograms a day of copper, right? So that's what you're shooting for. And the reason for that is we know that some of it's going to not be absorbed and it's going to get destroyed. But at 900 micrograms, that should get you to the place that you're looking for, right? Once again, the meats are going to be your highest, right? Whether it be the shellfish, the beef liver, the red meat. You can get them from your seeds and your nuts. You can also get them from true baking chocolate. Not all chocolate, but baking chocolate can do it. But then also mushrooms and potatoes. But remember, you're just going to need more of those to get that 900 micrograms compared to the more complex nutrients such as like red meat and that kind of stuff. You can pull copper levels. This is something we do in the world of functional health, that you can know how much copper is in someone's body. We believe that you need to be around 60 to 140 micrograms a deciliter, right? So if you go see a functional health provider, they may pull that. I think that's really, really important, especially before you start really supplementing with copper, because you could have too much, which could lead to some of those problems that we talk about, right? And so let's say you're eating this food. You're like, well, why is my copper still low? Would you know there's certain things that impact copper, right? Anything that impacts the world of the GI tract will impact copper absorption. Right? I know we talked about that last time with iron, where certain things like proton pump inhibitors, like your omeprazoles, or which also known as Prilosec, those kind of things that change the pHs of the stomach, anything that impacts overall gut microbiome, that can impact it. We also know that zinc will reduce the uptake of copper, right? So if you're supplementing with zinc, you're eating a lot of high zinc foods with your copper, you may see where you won't get all of that mineral in, right? So being very aware that if I'm taking a lot of zinc in and I need to increase my copper, I may need to turn my zinc down or eat those high copper meals without my zinc meal, right? But as we say, always, 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 if you can improve this through your food, prioritize the foods that we just talked about, because that is your best bet, right? However, we know that can be very challenging. And there are also supplements out there that can be very helpful. As we've talked about throughout this, these discussions, right, that all of these supplements have binders, right? And so if that's kind of new to you, you can go back and kind of reference some of the other episodes we've had. But knowing that when you see a supplement, right, whether you get it in a micronutrient, whether you're getting some kind of neurotropic, whatever, you'll see the name and then a binder with it, right? You'll see copper citrate or copper biglycinate, whatever that looks like. And that's just a binder that is with that mineral, attempting to help its absorbability, right? And get to certain places in the body and the brain. We see where copper citrate is probably the most common. However, the research is pretty conflicting on how bioavailable this is. So even though it's widely available in our supplements, it doesn't seem to be absorbed as well in the body. And so there is some discussion that it may not be the best way to go about your copper problems. What has been known of is the copper biglycinate. Remember, we've talked a lot about before about glycine, and glycine really improving the absorption of most minerals. Biglycinate, which is 2-glycine, really does that, right? And so we see where around 2 milligrams a day is a great place to start. However, you got to be very, very aware of the overdose risk, right? You can always consume too much copper. Not knowing your copper level can get really scary. And so I would say that, if you're going to take one of these supplements, that's fine, but you've got to be very aware that too much of it can lead to some problems, right? And that's where a lot of people, if you're able to, will pull full mineral, pull vitamin panels, and know kind of where you're at. Because ultimately, if you're at that low level, it's not a big problem. Even if at a low normal, it's not a problem. Where you're at an issue is if you're already up at that higher level, let's say that 130, 140, then you bring on this copper supplement on top of this. Now you're running the risk of that high copper problem, which we know looks like that hyperexcitability, that kind of stuff. We know that copper toxicity can lead to some severe damage. We know there's extensive treatments that can occur in the world of copper toxicity. We're not going to go into that today, but that is something that's there, right? We also know that there are detriments to copper if it's consumed like in a community. We've seen certain communities where copper's in the water, and there's some really big challenges of that, right? We've seen like issues in the world of overall brain functioning there. But at the end of the day, there is a chance that if you're having yourself feeling really down and low and frail, copper could be a part of it, right? And if that's the case, prioritizing the food like we talked about. But if you can't do that, the biglycinate copper, best way to get that supplement in, and do it with about 2 milligrams a day. So that is really our discussion on minerals, right? So if, like I said, if you haven't listened to the other ones, definitely go back and check out the other episodes. I've really enjoyed talking about this. I've had a lot of positive feedback from the listeners. So thanks for reaching out to me, because I think this has been a really cool discussion. A lot of times we don't talk about what is needed and what's not needed, right? And why the heck are these things even in the supplements that we're consuming? And so knowing this is what it's about, right? And also how you may get duped, that sometimes these magnesiums or these zincs or these coppers may not actually be the thing, or it may have a binder that doesn't get it to your brain the way you need it to. So just being very aware of that, right? But I think this can be really helpful, if you're a healthcare provider, just being aware, right? If I find this person who's hypoexcitable, hyperexcitable, whatever the symptom cluster shows me, could this be, right? Not to say it is, but could it be, right? And then doing an evaluation of these other symptoms, as well as biomarkers and some of these other things that we can do in evaluation to just see, right? Is this kind of the problem that's going on there? But thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here. I always recommend reach out to us on our Rucawell Instagram or on our website. That's my clinical practice. It's really kind of the mainstay of everything that we're doing, that Mental Maps also flows out of, right? So definitely engage with us there. That's a great way to talk to us about things that are going on. If you have interest, if you want to hear episodes done about things, different topics that are out there in the world of mental health, definitely be reaching out to us. We got some cool things coming up. But always thanks for joining me. And just remember, be aware of the supplements you're consuming. Prioritize your food to the best of your ability, and do the very best you can to move, get your sunlight, get your oxygen, and more times than not, wellness lies in that. Have a great day.